Hello, viewers. As the description says, tonight we are going to be looking through this awesome, I guess this is like a coffee table book is how I would describe it. I came across this last year when I was at Powell's Books, and I immediately was like, ooh, I had heard about this documentary years prior that I think I'd seen a couple clips from it on YouTube, back when I used to meticulously search for just random feminist themed content. And I have never actually watched it because I can't find a place to stream it or a place that has it, unfortunately. But I am really just excited to share this with you because it's really cool stuff that's in here. This booklet actually more details stuff from the actual suffragette movement as opposed to the documentary that was made. But anyway, this was released as a companion to go along with it. It was like a really big deal when the BBC put this out. So yeah, let's dig in. I hope you're excited. I love sharing this stuff, and I think it's a part of when we talk about our treasures, I have things like this, and I want to share them with all of you. Ugh. Anyway, and hopefully, my cat doesn't interrupt us. So, SB says, I went to Powell's for the first time recently. It was fun. It is fun, isn't it? They do make it fun, especially if you go to the big one downtown. So, anyway, the cover says a documentary by Midge McKenzie. The stirring history of the militant suffragettes, the voices, the faces, the deeds, the memories, the voices, the personal testimony of the remarkable women who fought and won the battle for the vote. Okay, and the back is interesting. It's a little messy. This copy was only $3.50. So, when I talk about finding treasure, this is the kind of stuff I live for. Finding a really old book from the 70s that's marked down. I'm there, right? It was October 10th, 1903, that I invited a number of women to my house in Nelson Street, Manchester, for purposes of organization. We voted to call our new society the Women's Social and Political Union, partly to emphasize its democracy and partly to define its object as political rather than propagandist. We resolved to limit our membership exclusively to women, to keep ourselves absolutely free from any party affiliation, and to be satisfied with nothing but action on our question. Deeds, not words, was to be our permanent motto. Okay, so this is exciting. It's even written in Barb Johnson, I think. Shoulder to shoulder. Look at that. Just, well. And then there's this lovely image of an actual suffragette in her best out there doing her work. This book, it says produced in 1975. Okay, I wasn't sure about the year. Yep. And the dedication. For my grandmother, Anne Charlotte Hames, and her children. Contents. The Making of a Militant. Portrait of Emmeline Pankhurst as a young woman. Deeds, Not Words, portrait of Sylvia Pankhurst. Votes for Women, Anne Kenny and Teresa Billington pose for press photographers. We Are Not Satisfied. Annie Kenny leads deputation to the Prime Minister. Rise up, women. A Lancashire mill girl arrested outside the House of Commons, March 20th, 1907. That looks interesting, yeah. Challenge the government. Emmeline Pankhurst carrying a petition from the Third Women's Parliament to the Prime Minister, February 13th, 1908. Power belongs to the masses. A section of the crowd attending the WSPU meeting in Hyde Park, June 21st, 1908. Lady C. Lytton. Portrait of Lady Constance Lytton. Hunger strike. A hunger-striking suffragette taking exercise in Holloway prison yard. Forcible feeding. An artist's impression of forcible feeding. Mary Raleigh Richardson. Members of the WSPU selling copies of their newspaper. Alias Jane Wharton. Lady Constance Lytton disguised as Jane Wharton. Truce. Emmeline Pankhurst, 1910. Black Friday. A member of WSPU deputation hurled to the ground on Black Friday, November 18th, 1910. From prison to citizenship. Part of the women's suffrage coronation procession, June 17, 1911. Women's War. A damaged store after a window smashing raid. Escape. Suffragettes mobbed and beaten while attempting to question Lloyd George, September 21st, 1912. Arson. A timber yard in Devonport burned down by suffragettes. The Split. Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst with Emmeline Pethick Lawrence. Guerrilla militancy. Members of the WSPU demonstrate outside Holloway Prison, November 1908. The Cat and Mouse Act. Emmeline Pankhurst recovering from a hunger strike attended by Nurse Pine. Raided. Interior of the WSPU offices after a police raid, April 30th, 1913. That'll be interesting to look at too. She Died for Women. The funeral procession of Emily Wilding Davison, June 14th, 1913. Petition to the King. Emmeline Pankhurst picked up bodily by Inspector Rolse outside Buckingham Palace, May 21st, 1914. War. The British fleet is dispatched to protect the French coast. The Vote. Women ambulance drivers at the French front. Victory for Women. An unknown woman casting her vote in the first election. Okay, so that's what we're looking at here. The Making of a Militant. So this is Emmeline Pankhurst, one of the leaders of the movement. Emmeline Pankhurst. Those men and women are fortunate who are born at a time when a great struggle for human freedom is in progress. It is an added good fortune to have parents who take a personal part in the great movements of their time. I am glad and thankful that this was my case. One of my earliest recollections is of a great bazaar which was held in my native city of Manchester. The object of the bazaar being to raise money to relieve the poverty of the newly emancipated Negro slaves in the United States. My mother took an active part in this effort, and I, as a small child, was entrusted with a lucky bag by means of which I helped to collect money. Young as I was, I could not have been older than 5 years. I knew perfectly well the meaning of the words slavery and emancipation. From infancy, I had been accustomed to hearing pro and con discussions of slavery and the American Civil War. Although the British government finally decided not to recognize the Confederacy, public opinion in England was sharply divided on the question both of slavery and of secession. What a pity she wasn't born a lad. An early holiday portrait of Emmeline Pankhurst's daughters, left to right. So let's see, left to right. So that's Sylvia, Adela, and Christabel. Squalid streets. Oh, Sylvia Pankhurst. Sylvia Pankhurst. Often I went on Sunday mornings with my father to the dingy streets of Ancoats, Gorton, Hulme, and other working-class districts, standing on a chair or a soapbox, pleading the cause of the people with passionate earnestness. He stirred me, as perhaps he stirred no other auditor, though I saw tears on the faces of the people about him. Those endless rows of smoke-begrimed little houses, with never a tree or a flower in sight, how bitterly their ugliness smote me. Many a time in spring as I gazed upon them, those two red May trees in our garden at home would rise up in my mind, almost menacing in sight. How bitterly almost menacing in their beauty, and I would ask myself whether it could be just that I should live in Victoria Park and go well fed and warmly clad, whilst the children of these grey slums were lacking the very necessities of life. The misery of the poor, as I heard my father plead for it and saw it revealed in the pinched faces of his audiences, awoke in me a maddening sense of impotence. And there were moments when I had an impulse to dash my head against the dreary walls of those squalid streets. In Manchester, the situation was acute. Under the stirring energies of Dr. Pankhurst, a committee for the relief of the unemployed was formed. Offices were opened and collections were sent into the streets. Funds were advertised for and subscriptions acknowledged in the Manchester Guardian. Food was distributed from 12 noon to 2 p.m. daily to all comers, no questions being asked. On Saturdays, I went with my mother to help with the distribution, heartsick at the grim sight of those hungry thousands waiting in the bitter cold to receive that meager aid. In May 1895, Dr. Pankhurst had accepted the invitation of the ILP to be its parliamentary candidate for Gorton, an industrial district on the outskirts of Manchester. The general election took place in July. So that was the Independent Labour Party. Okay. The death of Dr. Pankhurst. So this was like Emmeline's husband and Sylvia and Christabel's father. Here we go. There's Christabel. Look at that Edwardian fucking costume. Oh my god. Like, we just love watching shows with that. I mean, look at that. Can you just even imagine how strong they had to be, like, in their constitution to even wear clothes like this? Like, I think about putting something like this on and everything that it entails, and it's just like, oh my god, how did they manage these clothes? Okay, so this is from Emmeline Pankhurst. All these years my daughters had been growing up. All their lives they had been interested in women's suffrage. Christabel and Sylvia, as little girls, had cried to be taken to meetings. They had helped in our drawing room meetings in every way that children can help. As they grew older, we used to talk together about the suffrage. And I was sometimes rather frightened by their youthful confidence in the prospect, which they considered certain, the success of the movement. One day, Christabel startled me with the remark, "How long you women have been trying for the vote. For my part, I mean to get it." So here's Sylvia Pankhurst in her studio. Very lovely. She's quite a fascinating woman. You look at her story. Her life was quite wild. The way she lived it is very brave, honestly. So who is this? I don't know, but it's an interesting shot, isn't it? That's Sir Edward Grey. I don't know. Man of importance in this, I suppose. So the Votes for Women section. They're a little... very simple. I like that. I mean, I like that about these kind of images of the suffragettes. Like, it's just kind of the basicness of it. It looks far more militant. So this is Annie Kenney. To prison we went. Oh, these are her prison costumes. So yeah, it's interesting to think about all of these, like, just nice, respectable ladies getting put in prison, you know. But they weren't respectable. That's the thing. That's why they got the vote, is that they refused to be any longer. They had given up trying that game, you know. And it was in the U.S. when women adopted those same attitudes about respectability that things started to shift as well. We carry the fight to London. It's very interesting to think, you know, about the difference just as an American and kind of like an Anglophile just the cultural differences and political differences between Manchester and London, and like how often things seem to start in Manchester, but it's like it's never given like the time of day, Women who want a vote arrested. Okay, so this is cool. These are real pictures from the movement too. These aren't from the documentary. Look at her face. She just looks so defiant. All right, and here we go. Here's more images of women being arrested. Look how small they are compared to the men. God. We are not satisfied. Women need to say that shit more. Emmeline, okay, so this is Emmeline Pankhurst Lawrence. A successful little procession accompanied our deputation to the Prime Minister, including a body of women textile workers, who came from Lancashire and Cheshire, and a group of working women from the East End. Annie Kenney was attired on this occasion as a Lancashire mill girl, her hair in a plait on her back, her head covered with a shawl, clogs instead of shoes on her feet. One of the most touching figures in the procession was old Mrs. Wolstenholme Elmy, dear God, who had worked all her life in the old suffrage movement. She must have been pretty as a young woman, for although very fragile and weak, her complexion was still lovely, and she had little gray curls that framed her pink and white face. She was so tiny and so tottery that it seemed as if a breath of wind would blow her away. But she insisted on walking in the procession and was as keen and as eager as the youngest. Mrs. Pankhurst was the speaker for our deputation, and beside her walked Keir Hardie. We marched to the Foreign Office, where we all assembled. The Right Honourable Herbert Henry Asquith. Ugh. Christabel Pankhurst. Okay, so let's see. The Sinews of War. This is an interesting image. I think that's Christabel Pankhurst there. Not sure who that is, but it's an interesting image of them kind of working. Emmeline and Frederick Pankhurst Lawrence outside the law courts. Interesting. Rise Up Women. This is a very popular image. I see it used a lot now, even still, in like women's, I guess, memes, I would say. But not just that, like, it's an image used in like flyers and all kinds of things. Something about that image really speaks, doesn't it? This is Jessie Kenney as she tried to gain admittance to Mr. Asquith's meeting on December 10th, 1909. Disguised as a telegraph boy. Oh my goodness. So Women's Parliament. I just love the banners. Can I just say that? Like, that's the one thing here that I really can't get enough of when I think about this stuff. Okay, so Women's Social and Political Union votes for women. Very basic. Vote against the Liberal government. I like this image. Very striking. This one's pretty interesting. Flora Drummond arrested outside the Prime Minister's residence, 10 Downing Street. Third Women's Parliament. A Black Maria carries suffragette prisoners from Westminster to Holloway Prison. Look at that. They were put in this, like, rickety ass thing. Ugh. Challenge the government. Yes, and there's Emmeline. I mean, this photography is just so lush, isn't it? Something about older pictures. And that's Christabel and Emmeline. Power belongs to the masses. Emmeline Pankhurst. What a day was this Sunday, clear, radiant, filled with golden sunshine. As I advanced, leading with the venerable Mrs. Wolstenholme Elmy, the first of the 7 processions, it seemed to me that all London had turned out to witness our demonstration. And a goodly part of London followed the processions. When I mounted my platform in Hyde Park and surveyed crowds that were still pouring into the park from all directions, I was filled with amazement, not unmixed with awe. Never had I imagined that so many people could be gathered together to share in a political demonstration. It was a gay and beautiful as well as an awe-inspiring spectacle, for the white gowns and flower-trimmed hats of the women against the background of ancient trees gave the park the appearance of a vast garden in full bloom. The bugles sounded, and the speakers at each of the 20 platforms, began their addresses, which could not have heard by more than half of the audience. Wow. Okay. Oh my goodness. Christabel and Emmeline Pankhurst in the roof garden at Clement's Inn. This is an interesting image. Suffrage leaders and their symbolic banners commemorating women of all ages. Okay, so let's see. So number 1, this is Mrs. Despard, Women's Freedom League. 2, Lady Henry Somerset. Okay. 3, the Reverend Dr. Anna Shaw. 4, Mrs. Israel Zangwill Ryder. 5, Lady Frances Balfour. 6 is Beatrice Harraden, who is also a writer. 7 is Cicely Hamilton, a dramatist. 8 is Dr. Garrett Anderson, the first woman physician. 9, Mrs. Ayrton, electrical engineer. And 10, Mrs. Alfred Littleton, dramatist. It's interesting how many of them are being referred to by their husbands' names. I also had the thought of how, like, who made this? And why did they choose these particular women to uphold, I guess. Who knows why people do what they do, though. So interesting. Okay. This is from the Daily Mirror. An ingenious but unsuccessful attempt to see Mr. Asquith was made by the suffragettes yesterday, finding that they could send human letters to ladies dispatched themselves from the East Strand Post Office, setting off on their journey to Downing Street in charge of a telegraph messenger. One of the letters carried a card bearing the words, "To the Right Honourable H. Asquith, 10 Downing Street." Though well laid, the plan did not succeed, for when they arrived at the Premier's residence, only the messenger was admitted. After an interval, an official came out with the card, and notwithstanding was the ladies' protest that they had been paid for, said, "You cannot be delivered here. You must be returned. You are dead letters." The ladies then returned to the post office. The picture shows the letters, Miss McClellan and Miss Solomon, outside number 10 Downing Street. The upper portrait is of Miss Solomon and the lower Miss McClellan. So these are the women that disguise themselves as messenger boys to try and get in. Interesting. You can't really trust what you read in the Daily Mirror, though. It was true 110 years ago, and it's true now. Okay, so Lady C. Lighton. So this is this lady. What a nice photo. Okay, so her father was an earl, and her mother was a countess. Ugh. How posh, right? They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. What an interesting thing to contemplate. I wonder if it's true. So this is from Sylvia Pankhurst's perspective. The Women's Social and Political Union opened in the Prince's Skating Rink, Knightsbridge, a Votes for Women exhibition in the purple, white, and green. Mrs. Pethick Lawrence and the committee of the union were driven thither by a woman chauffeur in a motor car for which the suffragettes had subscribed in order that they might present it to the treasurer on her release from prison. The rink was covered outside with a mass of waving flags, the colors, and inside these also predominated. It's interesting reading upside down, I have to say. I'm getting better at it. The theme of the decorations which lined the walls of their great central hall was, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy. He that goeth from and weepeth, bearing precious seed, shall doubtless come again with rejoicing, bringing his sheaves with him." Is that a biblical quote? Is that what that's from? Let me know if you know. The exhibition lasted a fortnight, and at the end of the first week came a great surprise, for a women's drum and fife band consisting of members of our union who had been practicing in secret for months past, now dressed in a specially disguised uniform of purple, white, and green, formed up in the center of the rink, and with Mrs. Lay as drum major, marched out playing the Marseillaise? Is that what that says? And so I'm not familiar with the Marseillaise song, and then went round the town to advertise the exhibition. Hundreds of new members were made during the fortnight, and perhaps the smallest part of the whole achievement was that £5,664 was added to the WSPU's campaign funds. Actresses Franchise League. Okay, so interesting. Ellen Terry, Lila McCarthy, Gertrude Elliott, Mr. Forbes Robertson. All that white. Fourth Women's Parliament. Hunger strike. Oh dear. Christabel Pankhurst. Now happened something destined to have far-reaching influence on the militant movement, for it led to the adoption of the hunger strike. One of our members, Miss Wallace Dunlop, an artist of very resourceful mind, entered the House of Commons and stenciled in large letters on the wall of St. Stephen's Hall this aid memoir to the government and members of Parliament. Women's Deputation, June 29th. Bill of Rights. It is the right of the subjects to petition the King, and all committants and prosecutions for such petitionings are illegal. So sudden was her act that the police could not reach her in time to prevent her. Miss Wallace Dunlop was ejected from the house. 2 hours were needed to remove that unwelcome inscription. I wrote these words because I thought they were in danger of being forgotten by our legislators, and because I intended that they should be indelible, said Miss Wallace Dunlop when charged at Bow Street with willful damage by stenciling on a parliamentary wall the words of the Bill of Rights. She was sent in default of paying a fine to prison for 1 month. So it is Psalms 126:6. Okay. Thank you for looking that up or knowing it. Okay, so these are hunger strikers who are taking exercise in the Holloway prison yard. Miss Wallace Dunlop, taking counsel with no one and acting entirely on her own initiative, sent to the Home Secretary, Mr. Gladstone, as soon as she entered Holloway Prison, an application to be placed in the First Division as befitted one charged with a political offense. She announced that she would eat no food until this right was conceded. Mr. Gladstone did not reply, but after she had fasted 91 hours, Miss Wallace Dunlop was set free. She was in an exhausted state, having refused every threat and appeal to induce her to break her fast. Damn. And that's interesting, too, because they wanted to be recognized as political prisoners, but the government was refusing to do that. It was trying to treat them as like they were just disruptive, or like, her act was not a political act, but just an act of vandalism, right? Which kind of begs the question, like, what is the difference? It's another woman hunger striker. Unknown who she is. That's interesting. Ladies, make your starving meaningful. Look at these costumes. I mean, what is this? Zenobia. A pageant of great women was presented at the Scala Theatre, London, on November 10th, 1909. The pageant was written by Cicely Hamilton, arranged by Edith Craig, and performed by members of the Actresses Franchise League and leading suffragettes. Forcible feeding. Okay, so here's an image of a woman having one of these tubes shoved into her throat. Oh, let's hear what Sylvia Pankhurst has to say. On this day, the Prime Minister was going to Birmingham to hold a meeting of 10,000 people at the great Bingley Hall. A bower-bedecked special train was to carry the cabinet ministers and members of Parliament up north straight from their duties in the House and back again. Tremendous efforts were being made to work up the enthusiasm, for at this meeting Mr. Asquith was to throw down his challenge to the House of Lords to proclaim that their power of veto should be abolished, and that the will of the people should prevail. But the suffragettes were determined that, in the freedom to voice their will, were to be confined to half the people alone. There should be no peace in Birmingham for the Prime Minister. All right. Sounds pretty rad. Okay, what is this? Mary Lee dressed in her uniforms as drums major of the WSPU Fife Band. Another woman being force-fed. A daily sketch photograph depicting a reenactment of the forcible feeding. Okay, so this is a reenactment. Ugh. Now here's Keir Hardie. Okay, so only be thou strong and very courageous. This is Lady Constance Leyden in Newcastle, shortly before throwing a stone at Sir Walter Runciman's car. Mary Raleigh Richardson. Mary Raleigh Richardson, poet and novelist, was born in Canada. When she was 2 years old, her parents separated and she went to live with her grandfather in Belleville, a small town on the shores of Lake Ontario. Very little is known of her early life other than her love of outdoor life. And sport, she became proficient at jumping the logs that floated down the Moira River. It is no easy thing to keep one's footing on a floating tree trunk and leap from it onto another when it is rolling and pitching in turbulent water. Mary's favorite sport was to drag her sledge to the top of a hill, and at the foot of which ran a railway track. When a slow freight train came through, Mary, lying flat on her stomach on the sledge, found it was just possible to shoot between the bogies of the long timber wagons as the train was moving past and go careering on through the snow. Wow. Following her grandfather's death when she was 15, she traveled with friends to Paris. A year later, she moved to London, and when she was 20, she joined the Women's Social and Political Union. What a woman. Okay. America. This is interesting. I shall never forget the Emmeline Pankhurst. This month I made my first visit to the United States. I shall never forget the excitement of my landing, the first meeting with the American reporter, an experience dreaded by all Europeans. In fact, the first few days seemed a bewildering whirl of reporters and receptions, all leading up to my first lecture at Carnegie Hall on October 25th. The huge hall was entirely filled, and an enormous crowd of people thronged the streets outside for blocks. With me on the stage were several women whom I had met in Europe, and in the chair was an old friend, Mrs. Stanton Blatch, whose early married life had been spent in England. The great crowd before me, however, was made up of strangers, and I could not know how they would respond to my story. When I rose to speak, a deep hush fell but at my first words, I am what you call a hooligan. A great shout of warm and sympathetic laughter shook the walls. Then I knew that I had found friends in America, and this all the rest of the tour demonstrated. In Boston, the committee met me with a big gray automobile decorated in the colors of our union, and that night at Tremont Temple, I spoke to an audience of 2,500 people, all most generous in their responsiveness. In Baltimore, professors and students from Johns Hopkins University acted as stewards of the meeting. I greatly enjoyed my visit to Bryn Mawr College. Oh God, I butchered that. And Rosemary Hall, a wonderful school for girls in Connecticut. Everywhere I found the Americans kind and keen, and I cannot say much for the social welfare. The work of the women's clubs struck me very favorably, and I thought these institutions a perfect basis for a suffrage movement. Extreme sports indeed. All right. Alias Jane Wharton. So this is Lady Constance Lytton's disguise. It was interesting. I also read about Sylvia Pankhurst disguising herself once, or a couple of times, to go to different events. I mean, that's how interesting, you know? Truce. Interesting. Christabel Pankhurst. A truce was declared by Mrs. Pankhurst after the general election early in the year because she wanted the government to decide, in an atmosphere of peace and calm, what would be their action in regard to votes for women. In the new parliament, the general election had made the Liberal and Conservative parties equal in strength. The government had no longer any majority of their own. The remainder of the House of Commons consisted of Irish nationalists and 40 Labour members. The appearance of the government's majority was largely, if not mainly, due to the women's suffrage issue. Liberal women had not lost their enthusiasm for a government who would not give them the vote. The earnest and energetic campaign of Mrs. Pankhurst and her followers had stirred the electors to vote against the government. With the death of King Edward VII, with all the country were in mourning and in sympathy with Queen Alexandra. So, in a serious atmosphere of national peace, the Conciliation Committee for Women's Suffrage came into being, and a new chapter of suffrage history opened. So interestingly, this was like a split in the movement, and like tactics began to shift. Another demonstration in Hyde Park. Black Friday. Emmeline Pankhurst. It had been exceedingly difficult during these troublous days to hold all the members of the WSPU to the truce, and when it became perfectly apparent that the conciliation bill was doomed, war was again declared. At a great meeting held in Albert Hall, I myself threw down the gauge of battle. I said, because I wanted the whole matter to be clearly understood by the public as well as by our members. This is the last constitutional effort of the Women's Social and Political Union to secure the passage of the bill into law. If the bill, in spite of our efforts, is killed by the government, then first of all, I have to say, there is an end of the truce. If we are met by the statement that there is no power to secure on the floor of the House of Commons time for our measure, then our first step is to say, we take it out of your hands since you fail to help us, and we resume the direction of the campaign ourselves. More images of women being arrested. The death of Mary Clark. Mrs. Pankhurst's sister, Mary Clark, on ceasing to be Mrs. Pankhurst's deputy in the registrationship, she had become an organizer for the WSPU and thereby found release from the regretful memories of an unhappy marriage. Facing the rude violence of the seaside rowdies at Brighton, where she was stationed, she displayed a quiet, persistent courage which made peculiarly large demands on one so sensitive. Okay, so this made peculiarly large demands on one so sensitive. Exerting her frail physique to its utmost, she was grievously ill on the eve of Black Friday, and her Brighton comrades had begged her not to go. She had promised to take the easier course of arrest for window breaking and had telegraphed to Brighton from the police court, 1 month, I am content to pay the price of victory. Preparing to leave for America and revising the final chapters of the Suffragette, I spent Christmas alone at Linden Gardens. Early on the morning of Boxing Day, I saw at the window my mother's face, haggard and drawn. I ran to admit her. Something has happened. Aunt Mary is not very well, she faltered. She is dead, I know. Oh, man. Yes, she was dead. Our gentle confidant, too frail to weather this rude tide of militant struggle, released from prison 2 days before she had spoken at the welcome luncheon in London, hastened to Brighton to address a welcome meeting that the same night and returned on Christmas Eve to her brother's house in London. She was with Mrs. Pankhurst and others of the family at the midday Christmas dinner and quietly left the table. When Mrs. Pankhurst went to look for her, she found her unconscious. She had burst a blood vessel on the brain. Whew. Coronation year. From prison to citizenship. Members of the suffrage deputation to the Prime Minister outside 10 Downing Street, November 17th, 1911. Look at that sign. Look at this woman's sign. Join the next deputation. This is Miss Billingshurst. I think this is a wheelchair she's in. Quite an interesting design. Women's War. Silk, thistle, pansy, duck, wool. EQ. Emmeline Pankhurst. On March 14th, Mr. and Mrs. Pethick Lawrence, Mrs. Tuke, and myself were brought up for preliminary hearing on the charge of having on November 1st, 1911, and on various other dates, considered and combined together unlawfully and maliciously to commit damage, etc. The case opened on May 15th in a crowded courtroom in which I saw many friends. Mrs. Bodkin, who appeared for the prosecution, made a very long address in which he this was Mr. Bodkin, in which he endeavored to prove that the Women's Social and Political Union was a highly developed organization of most sinister character. Ooh. An artist's impression of the suffragette window smashing raid. It's quite a lovely drawing. Wow. Incredible, really. It's probably charcoal. Escape. Christabel Pankhurst. I was alone facing a great problem, a crisis for the movement. Those who had shared the responsibility were prisoners. What best use could I make of the few remaining minutes of the freedom to guard against the evident dangers? At any moment, the police would come. I did not sleep at all that night for thinking. Suddenly, in the small hours, I saw what I must do. Escape! The government should not defeat us. They should not break our movement. It must be preserved and the policy kept alive until the vote was won. My law studies had not been in vain. They had impressed in indelibly upon my mind the fact that a political offender is not liable to extradition. Long before, when actually a prisoner in Holloway, that thought had come to me in my prison cell as a matter of purely academic interest. Of course, if one ever did wish to avoid imprisonment, one could escape to a foreign country and, as a political offender, be able to stay there. Not an academic matter now, but one of vital, practical, political concern. I must get to Paris, control the movement from there, and from there keep the fight going until we won. And here she is in Paris, doing her thing. She escaped. Arson. Mary Richardson, alias Polly Dick. Arson, I cried. I fell limp. The word had haunted me for so long. I had known I should not escape in the end. I must pay the full price demanded of a suffragette. Yes, arson. This seemingly callous young creature repeated. Where? I asked. Oh, it's a wonderful old mansion, quite near London. Uninhabited, of course, for years, and away from everything. You see, what's happened is this, she went on. The girl who was to work on the job with Militant is ill, and Christabel feels we must put on the pressure now. We have the government in a bit of a bother with the insurance companies. You'll come up tomorrow, say for the details. Yes, I said, I will come up, but I'll go home. Right, she said. We'll get in touch with you there. But for heaven's sake, don't get arrested on the way. I could not smile. I had been through all the horrors. She had not. Yet I did try to understand her light-heartedness. I knew the worth of a carefree spirit in such a movement as ours. Suffragette Helen Olgston, having successfully interrupted Lloyd George's speech to the Women's Liberal Federation at the Albert Hall, London, December 5th, 1908. Wow. Uses a whip as a means of resisting the stewards who attempt to eject her from the meeting. Wow. Hello, Seven Heathen. A family in the East End. The East End campaign. So this is interesting. Sylvia, as we had read before, did a lot of work with trying to improve the lives of the poor and with trying to organize people living in poverty. George Lansbury, the East End of London. So he was a Labour Member of Parliament for Bow and Bromley. The Suffragette, November 22nd, 1912. Rally round Lansbury, the right for women's suffrage in Bow and Bowery. So this was a man who actually had taken up the cause of women's suffrage as part of his platform. Interesting. The Split. Emmeline Pankhurst Lawrence. At the landing stage, we were met by a friend who, as my home companion, had nursed many of the suffragettes after hunger strike, and therefore, without taking part in the political side of the movement, was everybody's friend. Instead of the smiles that we expected, sadness was written upon her face. I rallied her on her serious and grave aspect, and at last we asked her plainly, "Is everything the matter? Or is anything the matter?" I might ask someone that another time. Is everything the matter? Is anything the matter? Wait until we get home, she replied. Well now, what is it? I demanded as soon as the door was shut. They are going to turn you out of the Women's Social and Political Union, she said. I don't believe it. Impossible. Incredible. You are dreaming, was my vehement exclamation. It is true, she said, very firmly and sadly, and I want you to take it in before you see Mrs. Pankhurst. It was well that I had received this warning, for the next day Mrs. Pankhurst told me that she had severed her connection with me. For a moment I was stumped. My husband and I were not prepared to accept this decision as final. We felt that Christabel, who had lived for so many years with us in closest intimacy, could not be a party to it. Suffragist split. Mr. and Mrs. Pankhurst Lawrence leave the WSPU because of trouble, leaders' disagreement on militant policy. Here's an image of Emmeline Pankhurst. Guerrilla militancy. I'm interested in reading this bit. Sylvia Pankhurst. The brief truce before the withdrawal of the franchise bill and its amendments was followed by destructive militancy on a hitherto unparalleled scale. Petty injuries and annoyances continuing side by side with large-scale damage. Street lamps were broken. Votes for Women was painted on the seats at Hampstead Heath. Keyholes were stopped up with lead pellets. House numbers were painted out. Chairs flung in the Serpentine. Cushions of railway carriages slashed. Flower beds damaged. Golf greens all over the country, scraped and burnt with acid. Holy shit, hell yeah. A bowling green was cut in Glasgow. The turf in Duthie Park, Aberdeen. A mother and daughter bearing an ancient name spent much of their time traveling in trains in order to drop pebbles between the sashes of carriage windows, hoping the glass would smash on being raised. Old ladies applied for gun licenses to terrify the authorities. Bogus telephone messages were sent calling up the Army Reserves and territorials. Telegraph and telephone wires were severed with long handled clippers. Fuse boxes were blown up. Communication between London and Glasgow being cut off for some hours. There was a window-smashing raid in West End clubland, the Carlton, the Junior Carlton, the Reform Club, and others being attacked. They became rather ungovernable. Detectives examine a damaged train set on fire by suffragettes. Wow. Emmeline Pankhurst is supported by Dame Ethel Smith and Nurse Pine in attendance on the occasion of her arrest under the Cat and Mouse Act, May 26, 1913. Over 1,000 women have gone to prison. The Cat and Mouse Act. Let's read about this. This is a very interesting piece of this history. Sylvia Pankhurst, the government's new plan was formulated in the Cat and Mouse Act, a statutory memorial, unfortunately ineffaceable of their lamentable treatment of women and their cause. It was a revolutionary constitutional innovation, yet a liberal government preferred this unprecedented measure of repression to giving women the vote. The House Secretary had argued that the alternative to forcible feeding was to let the prisoners die. He assured the House that women were prepared to die for the cause. It has been said, he said, that not many women would die, but I think you would find that 30, 40, or 50 would come up, one after another. Finally, he foreshadowed the introduction of a new legislative act to deal with the matter. This proved to be the Cat and Mouse Act, as it was quickly named by critics of the government. This new way of coercion was meant for Mrs. Pankhurst. Her trial and the passing of the Cat and Mouse Act came together. The government prepared for their new fight against her by introducing this new measure, framed with the purpose of making her serve, in spite of the hunger strike, every single day the long sentence. So essentially what they did with this Cat and Mouse Act thing, because the women were hunger striking, the liberals of the government came up with this act essentially that made it law that if they were released once they went on hunger strike, they were set free. But as soon as they had eaten again, basically they were put back in prison. So essentially it was this way in which they could continue to keep arresting the women and just it was very disruptive of their lives, and this is a big part of this was because they didn't want to treat them as political prisoners. We have to remember that as well, because that was often what the women were demanding. The Cat and Mouse Act, passed by the Liberal government. The Liberal cat electors vote against him. Keep the Liberal out. you know? Kind of like how cats will let the mice go and catch them again. Raided. Okay, so this is when the offices were raided. And this is their newsletter. See the simplicity of this. I really love the simplicity of like militant, political, anything. Like, messages should be simple. They should be totally understandable. And I just love the like design and the delivery of a lot of this. I find it really inspiring artistically as well. Let's kind of flip through. She died for women. So this is about Emily Wilding Davison. I'm sure most of you have heard of her. She was the suffragette who jumped in front of the king's horse at a, what is this, a derby? That's what they call them, derbies. Oof. And here is her funeral. As you see, the women turned out and really gave her a show. Emily Wilding Davison. And so here's other suffragettes picketing outside the prison where some of their other members were imprisoned. Oh, this is fascinating. And this is one thing, the bodyguard of women. So one of the interesting things, this is Mrs. Garrett, who taught other women jiu-jitsu. It was quite it's one of the things that we don't hear much about in terms of like their movement, but yeah, a lot of the women were trained to do jiu-jitsu so that they could defend themselves, you know, because with this particular martial art, you can, as a woman who, you know, generally much smaller than a man, you can like use their force against them and flip them a lot of the times. Anyway, fascinating, isn't it? You know, when I look at this stuff and I think about just the trajectory of like women's movements in general, you know, it's interesting how many of the same things come up. Oh, no, sweetie. No. There we go. Oh, this is really cool. The Rothby Venus. Okay, this story is great. This woman, Mary Richardson, went into the National Portrait Gallery and took an axe and slashed this pornographic painting that some rich fucker had like donated, that all of these people were like, let's be honest, men were lining up to see this like image. And yeah, it was called the Rothby Venus. This is a very funny story. So yeah, she went in and she just slashed it. And if you go, it's actually, I believe it's still slashed. Or it's still, you can still see where it was slashed. Quite an interesting bit of history. So yeah, and another thing like this, she, you know, this was a degrading, to them, like a degrading portrayal of women, and was a way in which by destroying this image, the women could assert their own political like demand. Petition to the king. All right. This is another really iconic image. This is Emmeline Pankhurst being grabbed in the street by, I believe, plainclothes police officers. And here they are, arrested outside of Buckingham Palace. I think these are, oh yeah, these are more photos of the same arrest. Okay. Sisters to separate. Okay, so this is interesting. This is the separation between Christabel and Sylvia. Sylvia Pankhurst. Messages had been reaching me that Mrs. Pankhurst and Christabel desired to see me in Paris. The arrangements for the journey were made by Lincoln's Inn House. I was smuggled into a car and driven to Harwich. I insisted that Nora Smith, who had become financial secretary of the Federation, should go with me to represent our members. My uncle Herbert Golden, always kind and thoughtful, to my surprise, appeared to accompany me to the boat. He knew, I suppose, the reason for which I was summoned to Paris, though we did not discuss it. I was miserably ill in body and distressed by the reason of my journey. A small private cabin had been booked for us in an assumed name. I reached it without mishap, but my uncle came down to tell us that detectives were on the boat. So ill that I almost wished I might die, I was tortured throughout the night by the thought that I should be seized on, emerging from the cabin, and dragged back on the return voyage next morning. The detectives, however, were not seeking me, but on the trail of diamond thieves, and I landed at the Hook of Holland unmolested. The journey, which in other circumstances would have been delightful, seemed only excessively tiring. As soon as we reached Paris, the business was opened. Christabel, nursing a tiny Pomeranian dog, announced that the East London Federation of the WSPU must become a separate organization. The suffragette would announce this, and unless we immediately chose to adopt one for ourselves, a new name would be given to us. Nora Smith was known both to Christabel and Mrs. Pankhurst. Like me, she desired to avoid a breach. Dogged in her fidelities and my temperament, unable to express herself under emotion, she was silent. I said she had accompanied me to represent our members and to report to them. Therefore, she should be told the reason for our expulsion. My presence at an Albert Hall meeting had aroused ire for Christabel. The Daily Herald made matters worse by observing, "One great result of the militant suffrage movement has been to convince many people that the vote is not the best way of getting what one wants. Every day, the industrial rebels and the suffrage rebels march nearer together. Thus one found Mrs. Despard, Mr. Pethick Lawrence, and Miss Sylvia Pankhurst at the Albert Hall demanding the release of Jim Larkin, which was contrary to WSPU policy. I had gone to the Albert Hall to point out that behind every poor man there stands a still poorer woman. To Christabel Lansbury was a good fellow, of course, but his motto was, "Let them all come." The WSPU did not want to be mixed up with him. She added, a You have a democratic constitution for your federation. We do not agree with that. Moreover, she urged, a working women's movement was of no value. Working women were the weakest portion of the sex. How could it be otherwise? Their lives were too hard. Their education too meager to equip them for the contest. Surely it is a mistake to use the weakest for the struggle. We want picked women, the very strongest and most intelligent. She turned to me. You have your own ideas. We do not want that. We want all our women to take their instructions and walk in step like an army. Too tired, too ill to argue, I made no reply. I was oppressed by a sense of tragedy, grieved by her ruthlessness. Her glorification of autocracy seemed to me remote indeed from the struggle we were waging, the grim fight even now proceeding in the cells. Afterward, when we were alone together, Christabel, that sometimes we should meet, not as suffragettes, but as sisters. To me, the words seemed meaningless. We had no life apart from the movement. I felt bruised, as one does when fighting the foe without one is struck by the friend within. Also, fuck her. Again, yeah, another reason to admire Sylvia Pankhurst. The Beaux Militants, Sylvia Pankhurst, George Lansbury, and Daisy Lansbury. War. Emmeline Pankhurst, for the present at least, our arms are grounded, for directly the threat of foreign war descended on our nation, we declared a complete truce from militancy, which was answered half-heartedly by the announcement that the government would release all suffrage prisoners who would give an undertaking not to commit further crimes or outrages. Since the truce had already been proclaimed, no suffrage prisoner deigned to reply to the Home Secretary's provision. A few days later, no doubt influenced by representations made to the government by men and women of every political faith, many of them never having been supporters of revolutionary tactics, Mr. McKenna announced in the House of Commons that it was the intention of the government within a few days to release unconditionally all suffrage prisoners. So ends, for the present, the war of women against men. As of old, the women become the nurturing mothers of men, their sisters and uncomplaining helpmates. Ugh. The struggle for the full enfranchisement of women has not been abandoned. It has simply, for the moment, been placed in advance. When the clash of arms ceases, when normal, peaceful, rational society resumes its functions, the demand will again be made. If it is not quickly granted, then once more the women will take up the arms they today generously lay down. There can be no real peace in the world until women, the mother half of the human family, is given liberty in the councils of the world. And this is interesting. So this happened in Britain. In the US, there was a different approach taken by the suffragists here who, in wartime, which at the time was considered to be sedition, went outside the White House and protested. So it's interesting that while they were toning it down, the Americans began to kind of step it up. Sylvia Pankhurst in the East End. Sylvia Pankhurst. The war hardships arose immediately. The women in trouble came at once to the Women's Hall and asked for Sylvia. I was deeply impressed by their faith in the Federation and in me. They had fought with us and made sacrifices. I would strive to mitigate for them the burden of war. Our staff and members rose bravely to the occasion. The poor gallantly helping the poor. The East London Federation of Suffragettes acted as a trade union or a family solicitor on behalf of the people in need, approaching government, departments, magistrates, and local authorities as the case might require, and meanwhile, if other assistance were lacking, supplying the immediate sustenance required. All right, so some of the women ended up at the French front working as ambulance drivers. And a woman stoker working the furnaces of a large factory in South London. No sluggishness where women are concerned. How nice. Women stop and sign on here for munition work. Inequality and prejudice. The conflict, inequality, and prejudice shown in men's attitudes towards women workers were, however, much more significant than Emmeline Pankhurst chose to admit in her speech. Sylvia Pankhurst and the East London Federation of Suffragettes were strongly opposed to the exploitation of women as a cheap source of labor, even in time of war. The Women's Dreadnought received many letters like this one about conditions in the factories. Okay, let's read this. This sounds fascinating. Dear Miss Pankhurst, the first few women who entered the factory at which I work in Croydon, government contractors, received Sorry, I'm not sure what this means. This is like 12, I guess it's 12 shillings and 6, I don't know what the D stands for, sorry, a week, with the bait held out to them that under the premium bonus system, which is in vogue, the women would be able to earn £1 a week. Okay. Wow. Even at that time, like, yeah. So the new hands they are taking on only to receive 8 shilling a week, with a promise that when they know their work, they will have a rise. Take off the insurance 3D. Oh, I wish I knew what that meant. I know British money has changed since then. Like sometimes when I've watched like some historical like programs and stuff where they talk about money, like they just have different words now, or different. The money is different now. So they get 3Ds taken off, and unemployment contribution 5D, and that they cannot live on them. Some have children to keep. 3 weeks ago, the firm closed the applications list with 500 on their books. This makes the employers very independent. At the same time, it does not pay them to sack a hand that knows her work and take on a fresh one. The profits, I hear all around, are large, and the government, so I am told, since Lloyd George has been in control of the munitions department, is shoveling out the money to help contractors buy machinery. You ask about the work done. We make bomb fuses. Hours for all so far are 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. with 1 hour for dinner. No tea. No mid-morning lunch. Eaten on the benches. London. Oh, wait. No lunch eaten on the benches. A munitions worker. Okay, and this is what Sylvia has to say. As the war dragged on, involving the entire population in its sacrifices and in its imminence of conscription became apparent, it seemed to me that the claim of the whole people to enfranchisement could be urged with overwhelming logic. Again and again, we took the lead in calling upon such suffrage and labor organizations as were prepared to cooperate in joint demonstrations in Trafalgar Square, in Hyde Park, and in theaters and large halls. Whatever additional subjects such gathering might strive to promise, human suffrage took always a prominent place. We formed an adult suffrage joint committee with which more than 70 London labor organizations were soon affiliated. We lobbied the House of Commons persistently. In March 1915, a Board of Trade circular was issued appealing to women to register at the Labor Exchange for war service. Our East London Federation immediately wrote to the president of the Board of Trade, as well as to Asquith and Lloyd George, demanding equal pay for women with men and proper conditions and safeguards for women's labor. On April 13th, the Right Honorable Walter Runkman, president of the Board of Trade, called a conference to the women's organizations at the Board of Trade to encourage the registration. Hey, come on. There we go. The registration of women war workers. Mrs. Drake and I, on behalf of the Federation, were first to speak. We urged for women the vote and equal pay with men. Most of the other suffrage societies took the same line, but the National Union of Women's Suffrage Societies and the Women's Labor and Conservative Organizations promised unconditional cooperation with the government. Stop it, sweetie. The Women's Social and Political Union were not present. And here's more images of women working in World War I. Apparently, the British system used the abbreviation, for pound, S for shilling, and D for pence. I was wondering if it was pence, actually, after reading it. It was like, every time I've heard it, it's like, or I've heard it referred to as P, like, so 12 shillings and 6 pence. And then they had 3 pence taken off, and another 5 pence taken off as well. Hey, leave my plant alone. Oh, the death of Keir Hardie. I believe that Keir Hardie and Sylvia Pankhurst had a love affair, actually, so I don't know if I actually want to read that. And there's a nice image from the Women's Dreadnought, which was the that was the newspaper put out by Sylvia Pankhurst's Federation of, Federation of Women's Suffrage? I can't remember. Federation of Suffrage. So this is from the Women's Dreadnought. Let's read this. Keir Hardie has been the greatest human being of our time. When the dust raised by opposition to the pioneer had settled down, this will be known by all. He was a child of nature, akin to the Scotch moors. His father was a fisherman, and he too had the weather-fashioned look of those who follow the calling of the sea. He was built for great strength. His head was more grandly carved than any other, his deep-set eyes like sunshine distilled, as we see it through the waters of a pool in the brown earth. I think I will not continue reading this. It actually seems, despite being printed, that it's kind of personal, and also I don't know. Seems too sad, and also just too much. But the interesting thing about Sylvia Pankhurst as well at the time was that she also, didn't marry and, had a child out of wedlock at the time, which was also a big scandal. So, that's another interesting thing about her. She just did not, she lived her life while she did her work, she also lived a very non-traditional life as a woman at the time, or what was expected of a woman of her class. Save the children. With renewed passion, Sylvia launched a further appeal to save the children. The doctor who was active in running the baby clinics backed this appeal with the current statistics of the infant mortality rate. Babies, Dr. Barbara Tchaikovsky. We are losing this year 100,000 to 170,000 babies out of our annual gift of 800,000. Shall we not save the nations at home while our youth is shedding its life's blood abroad? There is no time to be lost, for while we talk and deliberate. Every half hour, 5 babies die, and many more are maimed, to grow up one day to swell the ranks of the millions now so unfit as to be unable to serve their country in its need. And here's Sylvia Pankhurst with a deputation of old age pensioners. Not might, but right. What a message. Women's war work. The needs of the war were escalating, and in April 1916, conscription was introduced by the government. As a result, even more women were needed to fill jobs as men entered the armed forces. And this is, women working in workers operating cranes in a shell filling factory. So it wasn't just that they were doing jobs, they were specifically doing these jobs of producing war materials. And this is men and women workers checking shells in a shell filling factory. Wow. What an image. On her, their lives depend. Women, munition workers. Interesting. One thing that the last thing I've been binge watching, just to do a side note here, is the BBC show Horrible Histories. And one that I recently watched had a story about how women sometimes would steal TNT from the munitions factories or whatever and use it to dye their hair or to bleach their hair. But one of the other side effects is that working with it would often turn their skin yellow as well. So it's kind of interesting. But yeah, that was one way that women bleached their hair during that time. Russia. In March 1917, there was deep concern in England that Russia might withdraw her troops from the war as a result of the revolution, thus seriously weakening the position of England and her allies. Emmeline Pankhurst had continued to work closely with Lloyd George, now Prime Minister, and on June 1st, 1917, she wrote to him requesting permission to travel to Russia. And here's her letter. Dear Mr. Lloyd George, we have come to the conclusion that it is the duty of our union to send immediately to Russia a representative who will explain to the Russian people the opinions as to the war and the conditions of peace held by us as patriotic British women loyal to the national and allied cause. I therefore write to you to ask that the necessary passports and permits be given to myself and my colleagues who are to accompany me to Russia on this patriotic mission. The British government, according to a statement appearing in today's papers, are sincerely desirous of enabling the Russian government and people to have an opportunity of hearing at first hand the opinions of all sections of British thought, and therefore the necessary facilities for myself, my colleagues, to travel to Russia will, we know, in accordance with this policy, be given at once. Considering that Mr. J. R. MacDonald and other representatives of factories described in the press of today as not over enthusiastic in a vigorous prosecution of the war, are allowed to visit Russia and preach their unpatriotic and fatal doctrines, there could be no excuse for preventing or delaying the visit to Russia. Ourselves, the representatives of a patriotic movement. The great burden of responsibility which you as Prime Minister have assumed will only be increased, and your task of saving the nation by victory rendered more difficult by the activities of Mr. MacDonald and his friends. What a fucking narc, dude. During their stay in Russia, our purpose as patriots and as friends and champions of freedom is the very opposite of theirs. Of your own approval of our mission, we are sure, and we shall be very greatly obliged if you will give the necessary directions to the departments concerned, so that we may at once proceed on our journey to Russia. I am, yours faithfully, Emmeline Pankhurst. Permission was granted. Emmeline Pankhurst and Jessie Kenny sailed from Aberdeen to Norway and traveled overland to Petrograd. Well, it's interesting that you say that, because it seems to me that, like, in every, like, revolutionary movement, or every revolution that has happened, like, whether you look at Russia, whether you look at Iran or whatever, women are the workers who seem to, like, set it off. Like, it always seems to start there, and then it kind of grows and grows. Women workers are really, like, the ones that make it happen. Long live Russia, long live the Allies. Telegraph received from Mrs. Pankhurst, 1st Women's Battalion, number 250. A speech delivered at the Army and Navy Hall by Emmeline Pankhurst. Oof. See, I can't get with all of this. I mean, the Women's Party. The Women's Party victory, national security and progress. The vote. One of the most important effects of the WSPU militant campaign was to bring women into the non-militant suffrage societies in large numbers. The issue of votes for women had been politely broached by the constitutional societies through the years, but with very little success and minimal interest. The controversial tactics of the WSPU and their widespread news coverage revitalized the question of votes for women, and the non-militant suffrage societies became stronger and more powerful. In April 1916, the Liberal and Unionist War Committee had demanded a vote for every soldier in the trenches. To be eligible to vote, the existing franchise laws required men to be qualified as householders and to have occupied a dwelling for at least 1 year prior to the 15th day of the July preceding an election. As a result of these qualifications, the enormous numbers of men serving abroad in the armed forces and the men who had moved to different parts of the country to undertake war work had by accident lost their voting rights. Wow. Was it by accident, though? The non-militants. Millicent Garrett Fawcett. Members of Unit 7, First Aid Nursing Yeomanry wearing their gas masks. This unit served with the French forces at Epernay. Franchise and electoral reform. So what is this image? Queen Mary's Army Auxiliary Corps camped in Crécy Forest, France, June 1918. Look at those coats. Women drivers in the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, Calais, January 1917. Wow. Those are some furs. There's that guy again, the Right Honorable Herbert Henry Asquith. What a name. The House of Commons, March 28, 1917. House of Commons debates. I beg to move that this House records its thanks to Mr. Speaker for his services in presiding over the Electoral Reform Conference, and is of the opinion that legislation should promptly be introduced on the lines of the resolution reported from the conference. My opposition to women's suffrage has always been based solely on considerations of public expediency. I think that some years ago I ventured to use the expression, "Let the women work out their own salvation." Well, sir, they have worked it out during this war. How could we have carried on the war without them? Short of actually bearing arms in the field, there is hardly a service which has contributed or is contributing to the women or to the maintenance of our cause in which women have not been at least as active and as efficient as men, and wherever we turn we see them doing with zeal and success and without any detriment to the prerogatives of their sex, work which 3 years ago would have been regarded as falling exclusively within the province of men. But what I confess moves me still more in this matter is the problem of reconstruction when this war is over. The questions which will then necessarily arise in regards to women's labor and women's function and activities in the new ordering of things, for do not doubt it, the old order will be changed, are questions in regard to which I for my part, feel it impossible consistently, either with justice or with expediency, to withhold from women the power and right of making their voice directly heard. And let me add that since the war began, now nearly 3 years ago, we had no recurrence of that detestable campaign which disfigured the annals of political agitation in this country, and no one can now contend that we are yielding to violence what we refused to concede to argument. I therefore believe, and I believe many others who have hitherto thought with me in this matter, are prepared to acquiesce in the general decision of the majority of the conference that some measure of women's suffrage should be conferred. Some measure, right? Remember that, some measure. And they had also taken away a lot of men's votes at this time as well, which is interesting. Like, they had enfranchised men of like the lower classes and then taken away it again. So this is kind of an interesting thing. So when they did give women the vote, they didn't give it to all women, which is pretty important to recognize. Anyway, I don't want to keep reading that dude's words. This is an interesting image. Daily Mirror, January 11th, 1918. Votes for women passed by Lords. Many pressures listened to grave warnings. Majority of 63. Earl Curzon fears socialistic influences. Bishop support bill. Women's Royal Air Force motorcycle. Okay. Victory for women. Hurrah, it's a fine ending to a long fight, said a member of the New Women's Party when told of the House of Lords' decision to grant the vote to over 8 million women. It was a victory for the married women and the spinster alike, a victory for all those imprisoned by a society that totally denied women any human rights. The House of Lords' decision represented the end of a long struggle by both the militant and the non-militant suffragists, always united in their belief in the essential equality of men and women, who had fought and strived for the vote using every tactic from the most genteel persuasion to the most violent confrontation. More than 1,000 suffragettes had been imprisoned for demanding that women should have the most basic and simple right to vote. Solitary confinement, hard labor, brutality, broken health, and ultimately death were the price paid by women of dedication and conscience for their belief that all women should be free. Well, what do y'all think? What a thing. So yeah, it's one of these things that's, again, it's like I said, a piece of treasure, you know. You pull it out and you flip through it and you find things that are inspiring, or you remember things. Or you learn new things. Because it's one of those ones where you just don't read this through. You kind of flip through it and kind of take what you need from it. So I think for this one specifically, I really enjoyed that line about sowing in tears and reaping in joy. That was put when the woman was released from prison. I can't remember her name, but that was quite inspiring and something to think about. It's rather hopeful, isn't it? And it also puts like all of our like struggles into perspective. So anyway, thank you for again joining me to look at this, and thank you to Nero for only being a little disruptive, and thank you for all of those who looked things up for me. I actually appreciate when you do that when I'm doing these things, because it can be way too distracting to do it by myself. So now I know how to read about money in, oh, hi baby. Read about British money historically. I mean, who knows? It'll probably come up at some point in my life again. You chewing on me? You chewing on me? What did you think? What did you think of the book? You gonna say goodnight? You gonna say goodnight? All right, we're saying goodnight. I hope you all are well. No. Oh, you want to wrestle? You want to wrestle? I guess I shouldn't speak for him. I'm well. I hope you're well. And I would like to think that Nero hopes that you're well too, but no, not make you mad. Little demon. I love you. All right, well, farewell. Thanks for joining me for another show and tell. Bye.